Hi, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of We Talk to Really Smart People, one of the many ways that our podcast, Feminism, Fascism, and the Future, is trying to help us all understand the global anti-gender movement. This is Harper.
And I'm Elle. We are students at Middlebury College and also two of the people who make Feminism, Fascism, and the Future. This past July, Lori and us got to interview Judith Butler about their new book, Who's Afraid of Gender?
For those of you who don't know, Judith Butler is a huge name in the field of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. They're a professor, an author, and an activist. They have a ton of books, and they were one of the first to conceptualize gender as a social and performative construction as opposed to something innate or binary. In other words, this was a huge deal to interview Judith Butler. Honestly, a dream come true. Elle, how would you describe the experience of interviewing Butler?
Honestly, I was in awe of everything Judith Butler had to say. Especially after reading their works in my gender studies classes, it was literally just an incredible opportunity to ask them questions about the anti-gender movement. They were kind, full of wisdom, and granted me a sense of hope in the midst of the global crisis surrounding gender. Harper, how about you?
Meeting Judith Butler, even just through Zoom, was a dream come true, and it was so inspiring to hear them think out loud and articulate their views of the world, at large and specific to the anti-gender movement. I was so nervous to be in their presence. They're someone I look up to greatly and admire beyond words, but they were so very kind and helpful. I'm so thankful for the opportunity.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up for me too. We talked about their new book and about who is afraid of gender. The book gives us a deeper understanding of the global anti-gender movement and feels like an urgent call to action to start paying attention to this rhetoric. Our first question was, so who is afraid of gender?
I have a friend who asked me the title of my book when it was in press, and I said, "Who's afraid of gender?" And he said, "Oh, well, everyone's afraid of gender." But then I had to take that seriously. Is there some way that we're all a little afraid, like what does gender expect of me, or what is meant when I get gendered in a certain way, or am I doing gender right, or that kind of question? I think gender raises fundamental questions about who I am and how I understand myself, how I ask to be understood by others, what is changeable in me, what has changed, what might still change. And for some people, a lot of people will just say, I don't want to hear this. I can't deal with this. This is a fixed truth in my life, in my understanding of the world. I don't want that challenged. I don't want that destabilized. So folks who are made deeply uneasy by the idea of self-determination in matters of sex or gender, depending on your vocabulary, can become furious. And there are forms of reactionary fear and hatred that we are seeing in conservative and right-wing politics across the world that claim that gender is variously attacking our idea of civilization, the family, what we mean by man, what we mean by woman, what we mean by mother and father, what we mean by nature or the rules of religion, right? So that's just one constellation of concerns. So there's a very specific right-wing attack on gender, which tends to be not just an attack on trans people and their fundamental rights to identify themselves and gain recognition legally and medically for who they are, but also feminism, the analysis of systemic inequalities in society, gender analysis of that kind, reproductive freedom, reproductive justice, laws and policies against sexual harassment, rape, femicide. All of these things get clustered under gender, as does teaching about gay and lesbian sexuality or bisexuality in the schools, or policies that support gender affirmative healthcare for youth, and also clearly questions of political equality and emancipation at a most fundamental level, like who deserves to be free whose freedoms are recognized as legitimate freedoms, whose are not. So there are many people who are, I would say, afraid of gender on the right. And here I would include some trans exclusionary feminists who identify with the right wing, but I would also include trans exclusionary feminists who don't identify with the right wing, but who find themselves making the same arguments as the right wing. And those fears are slightly different, as we know. I think trans exclusionary feminists usually fear that trans women in particular will be taking over the category of women, or will be invading their spaces or doing harm to them, taking away their rights, appropriating their histories, etc. These are the two main constellations of anti-gender. And I would say that in both cases, there are deep fears at work, fears that can easily turn to hatred, and very often do, and can then be exploited by right-wing elected officials or candidates for major positions or movements or parties who seek to amplify state powers of censorship and rights stripping and gain popular support for doing so.
Well, there you go. Judith Butler summarizes this entire podcast in just under 10 minutes. I guess our work here is done. But of course, they had even more depth to add to our understanding of how anti-gender movements work, both as fear and as anti-democratic projects. Here's Butler talking about the fascist tendencies of the anti-gender politicians.
There's a fascist trajectory to the extent that fascism relies on passions of fear, hatred, scapegoating, and also policies that strip people of fundamental rights like self-determination, autonomy, whether for trans people or non-gender conforming youth or women of the reproductive kind who seek to have rights of autonomy or equality in terms of reproductive health care.
We asked Butler why so many academics who study the anti-gender movement are afraid to use the word fascist.
I do think that some people use the term too quickly. And so, and you see it on placards and slogans as like, no to the fascists, or that person's a fascist. You can bandy it about in a relatively unthinking way, or you can put a lot of different kinds of political actors together in the one bucket and think you're doing something right. So, it's right to ask those of us who insist on using the term to think about it carefully. That's okay. I think that's a perfectly legitimate challenge. And I think I have at least 3 reasons for using the term. And I use it in a very specific way. One is, actually, it was Umberto Eco some time ago who said that if we're going to understand fascist appeal, like how fascists appeal to ordinary people who are trying to make sense of their lives, who are reading the newspaper, who are in conversation with each other, they may not be all that well educated, or they may be well educated and still deeply disoriented. One of the things that the appeal tends to do, according to Eco, is put together a lot of contradictory elements. So you would say, for instance, gender. Gender is an ideology, A, which is already a falsehood. It's not an ideology. It's a very complex field of study. It appears in various forms historically, across discipline. It's not a single ideology. That's just nonsense. Okay. But let's unify it. It's an ideology and it's coming at you. And it consists of hypercapitalism, but it's actually authoritarianism. But it's actually a form of seduction. No, it's also a form of indoctrination. It's like you can contradict yourself. It's a colonizing influence from the North, or it is an anti-colonial project which threatens to destabilize civilization as we know it and as Christian missionaries have brought it to us in the global South. Okay. So there are all these contradictions, but in a fascist constellation, that is to say, an appeal to fascist passions, all of those disparate elements, which would be contradictory if we took them apart, are allowed to coexist in a single way. Like we don't need to make it coherent. We accept the contradictoriness. And that means that our fears, if we're affected by this, our fears, they all get to coexist without having to be reconciled in any rational or coherent way. So it produces a contradictory constellation in which all of the anxieties that you might be feeling, or many of them, are appealed to and amplified and incited so that you can work into a certain kind of a frenzy. So fascist discourse and fascist appeal allow for widely contradictory beliefs to be held together at the same time, and for anxiety and fear to be amplified as a result of that kind of contradictory bundle. Secondly, once one is incited and believes one has found the cause of all one's anxiety and fear, and let's call it gender, or let's call it critical race theory, or we call it ethnic studies, or the migrant, right? We feel ourselves to be entitled to an eliminationist discourse. That is to say, we need to get rid of this. If we got rid of gender, if we got rid of migration, if we got rid of race, then what threatens our existence will be resolved. So the policies that end up coming out of that frenzy are censorship and rights stripping and expulsion and eliminationist discourse, if not practice. All of those are actual fascist activities. Now, some people who work in the history of fascism will say, oh, well, we know fascism from the 20th century and it has the following features, or here's Paxton's typology. That's the reigning, paradigm in political sociology. I think the rejoinder is to say we're living in a different time. This is a different configuration of fascism. Fascism has a history. It doesn't just take a single form. And then again, as a corollary of that, looking back at the emergence of fascism in Germany or Italy, we're going to take the mid 20th century as the point of reference. People should have saw it coming. They should have identified the potentials. Remember, yeah, it was odd. Hitler got elected and he started taking away rights, segregating groups this way and that. And, oh, you couldn't go in that. You had to wear this thing. It's like, wait a minute, that is the practice of identifying the potential emergence, or what we could just call fascist potentials, is extremely important. We don't have to wait for a full fascist state to emerge before we can call something fascist. Then we would never be able to stop that state from emerging, right? We have to identify the potentials in advance. That's part of our political responsibility. And I suppose my last point is simply this, that I focus on fascist passions. Fascist passions are the ones that come to convince people that this group does have to be eliminated or excluded or stripped of their rights, because that's the only way to save the children, the family, the nation. These people are doing harm, so we can strip those harm-inducing people of their capacity to act or to be free or to belong to a community or to have basic rights. We can do all that kind of right stripping with a sense of being justified. So that kind of desire to strip other people of basic rights can get morally rationalized in a fascist mindset, so that the fascist actually understands themselves to be doing the right thing, even as they are destroying other people's lives.
Okay, so if I understand what Butler's saying, we can use the term fascism to describe the anti-gender movement because it has the following three traits. 1, it can tie contradictory ideas up together into a single enemy. So, in this case, gender can come to signify everything from LGBTQ rights to abortion rights to gender studies and to feminism. They can represent everything from hyper-capitalism to colonialism, all of which are a threat to everyday people. Second, fascism starts with an eliminationist discourse. Once we identify who the enemy is, we need to strip them of their rights or even fully eliminate them. And third, this desire for eliminating the enemy, in this case gender, brings forth a sort of passion in people because they see this elimination as justified, as saving the children or civilization or whatever.
I was really struck by how Butler pointed out that we cannot wait for a fascist state to emerge before we use the word, because by the time that happens, it is almost always too late to fight back, since fascist states control the media, the universities, and really any place in society where resistance could thrive. Next, we asked Butler, but why gender? Why has gender become the enemy against which these fascist movements organize?
We do have a new formation of fascism that we're looking at, and it shares basic features with other forms of fascism. Let's think about the Vatican or Meloni in Italy. Meloni will say, "Do you want your sexed identity taken away?" And she says, these gender people, they will take your sex away. You know, your sexed identity as a man, as a woman, right? Looks out at the audience, looks at the men. They will take your sexed identity away. They will take your sexed identity away to the women, that you will no longer be able to say mother, father. How important is it to you to be a man? And, there are many people who are like, oh my God, these gender people are going to take this away. So they imagine a kind of something absolutely vital to who you understand yourself to be in the society is going to be ripped from you. But once she convinces them that this gender is going to do this, which is, of course, completely false, nobody who works in the field of gender is going to take anybody else's sexed identity away or stop people from being a mother or father or calling themselves that. I don't know. Even the abolitionists don't say that. She then can say, so we have to stop these people from having legal rights to change their assigned sex. We have to reverse assigned sex. We have to refuse lesbian parenting rights. We have to refuse access to surrogacy on the part of gay men. So she's actually taking away rights. She's involved in a right stripping activity. But how does she get to do that? Well, she gets to do that by producing a specter, a fearsome specter that these gender people who are representing trans, gay, lesbian, bi, intersex folks, that their basic aim is to strip you of your fundamental right to your identity as you understand it. Now, the Vatican has likened gender to the Ebola virus, to a nuclear warhead, to Hitler Youth. So here's the Vatican. People trust the Vatican very deeply. When the Vatican says something like this, they're going to feel fear. And if it is, as some Catholic theologians say, the work of the devil, that is to say, undoing the doctrine of creation as stipulated by the Bible, then what do you do with something that is now identified as a demonic power in society? Well, most people would say you drive the demon out. If we ask ourselves what drives people to censor, to strip people of rights, and to even negate the reality of another person's existence. It's not arbitrary. They have accepted a certain version of how dangerous these progressive dimensions of political movements are. And they're fighting against the devil, or they're fighting against what they see to be a serious source of destruction to the fundaments of their own life.
Butler's describing how it is that people become willing to deny other people the right to exist. It is so easy if you believe that person is a threat to your own existence.
But how is it that some radical feminists get to the same point of denying rights to trans and non-binary people?
There are friends who've gone down that path, and then there are people in the middle who are like, what do I make of this? So I tried to write my book for the people in the middle who are, what do I make of this? It's kind of disturbing. I don't know what to make of these claims. I hear this on one side and this on the other side. How do I sort this? So I tried to write a book that would be kind of patient and not too vitriolic, because most of the debates on this topic are characterized by high vitriol. In my reading, I find that there are usually two main features of trans-exclusionary feminism. One is a fear that something is being taken from them, a fear of appropriation, that they've struggled long and hard to establish women's movements, women's spaces, women's rights. And suddenly there are trans women who are coming into these spaces or coming into this discourse and saying, we are women too. And they feel that if they were to open their gates to say, yes, you are. Please come with us. Glad to have you. Uh, that something fundamental would be taken away, right? So there's this idea of being stolen from. Now, I take this to be kind of phantasmatic, and I suppose I could be faulted for psychologizing, but I don't think we can understand these phenomena unless we have something of a psychoanalytic frame about how do people put things together in this way. We're not talking about reason. We're not exactly talking about dreams, but there is a kind of dream structure in the way that people put things together that makes you wonder, like, why would you go there? Why would that be the fundamental thing you understand to be happening when trans women are asking to be recognized or seeking to have basic rights that give them healthcare and legal recognition, and et cetera? And then there's a second one, which is that actually these trans women are men. They're disguising themselves and they're using a trans facade as a way of getting into women's spaces and doing harm to women, right? So there's an idea that trans women are men who seek to harm women. And of course, you can find a couple of examples in which that is true in women's prisons, like maybe 2 examples that I know of. But it's another thing to say, oh, these examples are exemplary of what trans women do, or they all do that. Now, we wouldn't accept that if you said to me that, all Jews are rich and, seek to exercise power through their financial means and are only driven by profit or something like that. I mean, I would recognize that as an anti-Semitic trope and I would object. And if you showed me an actual Jewish person who is that way, I could say, all right, but why would you take that example and make it into an exemplary model for all Jewish people? I would, and most thinking people, I would hope, would say, yeah, we don't do that. Like, that's not okay. That's not okay. Like, oh, one Black person committed a criminal offense. Yes, as many other people have. Oh, that's what Black people do. No, we don't accept generalizations of that kind. So even if you can show the 1 or 2 trans women who were in women's prisons and did harm other women, do we really say that's what trans women are all about? So, I mean, those are the sort of 2 models I see. And I think that there are many ways of responding to that. I think there's a misunderstanding of where the penis resides for a trans woman, for instance, why trans women have themselves repudiated certain kinds of masculinity or even sexuality. Should we learn a little bit more about what trans women's relationship is to the penis before we start assuming that they are just regular rapists? I think we should stop and pause and learn about what's going on there. And then, of course, we're all opposed to violence against women in prisons or any other place, but we would also be against violence against trans women, would we not, if they were forced into a men's prison? And what does happen? One of the documented facts on what happens to trans women who are put in men's prisons. Do we think that's a safe and lovely place for them? And I had a discussion with somebody in San Francisco, an open, she called herself a TERF. I'm a TERF, it's like, okay. And she basically said, look, I live in fear. I have fear of violence. And if I were in a prison or in a women's space and a trans woman came in, I would have a fear of violence. And I just thought, okay, let's start here. We all fear violence. Broaden the scope. Who's fearing violence these days? Well, Ni Una Menos group in Argentina, Las Tesis in Chile, they are all telling us that there's violence against migrants. There's violence against Black people from Bahia. There's violence against women assigned female at birth. There's violence against trans women, trans men, butches, certain violence against butches. Learned a lot about that in South Africa. There's violence against a number of gender nonconforming people, including travestis, who are neither trans nor gay, exactly. Why wouldn't we band together? Like, why wouldn't we all get together and oppose violence against all of us? Like, why would we oppose violence against one group and not oppose violence against another group. Or turn to another vulnerable community and say, oh, you are the ones who are threatening us, rather than looking at the state powers. I mean, it never occurred to me that you could be a feminist without a really strong, broad alliance, understanding the intersecting ways in which power is working. Otherwise, what are we? I mean, where's Audre Lorde?
Butler went on to explain that part of what trans exclusionary feminists misunderstand is that the body can be both material and messy, something Rebecca Jordan Young discussed a lot in episode 3, just in case you want to go back and listen to that.
There's another issue, which is biological reductionism. And I think, wow, a lot of the trans people say, well, sex is a fact. You deny biology. And Butler in particular refuses the materiality of the body, right? An old song. But the body has always lived in some social situation or another. And even the biological sciences now accept that environment and physiology interact, and they're both changed by virtue of that interaction. So what does it mean to separate the body from its interactions, to pretend that it is something like a simple fact that is not living and dynamic and nurtured, changed by environments and also affecting environments? We can't understand nutrition or climate change or even sexual development without an interactive model of that kind. I mean, no one's disputing biology, but to say that biology is all I am, or most fundamentally what I am, and biology should be understood as this cause and this fact that's separated from all interaction with history, society, culture, economics, environment, soil, air. I don't understand it.
Next, we asked Butler how white supremacy structures the insistence that the body is a strict and clear binary, since racial hierarchies have so often relied on gender hierarchies, like masculinizing Black women or feminizing Asian men.
I think we have to understand in particular what the history of the biological sciences and gynecological practices, how that history intersected in the US with slavery and the experimentation on Black women's bodies, trying to change or violently and surgically transform anatomies in order to approximate a white ideal of what femininity should be. And this is obviously part of the work that's going on now in a lot of Black trans studies. And we see that, the biological sciences have never been neutral on the question of race. They've always been brokering the question, what is the ideal form of the human species? What is the subordinate or deficient form? So within certain forms of biological racism, and there are unfortunately many, this idea of the biological sciences determining racial hierarchies actually was materialized in gynecological practices, which, as Snorton says, and Hortense Spillers before him, used Black women's bodies as mere flesh to produce gender as white ideals. And even in the civilizational missions that went into Latin America, they were imposing ideas of women and men that belonged to the Christian ideal of a certain kind of duality. Men had certain distinct virtues, women had other virtues. There was a hierarchy that kept the universe ordered and was in accord with God's will. But those ideas of gender, they seem to be abstracted from race, but they were racialized. They were white Christian ideals that were imposed on Black and brown communities and which were obligatory forms of assimilation. So gender norms have always worked, at least partially, in the service of assimilation to white norms.
Finally, we were able to talk a little bit about how, within the anti-gender movement, Professor Butler is the face of this demonic force that is gender ideology, and we wanted to know how that has impacted their personal life.
It's funny because in Brazil, when I was burnt in effigy, they treated me as a witch. I mean, it was the burning of effigy that happened to me. I was the witch, but I was a kind of trans witch, apparently, according to them. But that practice was part of the practice of witch burning. So we should ask who's the witch where. When I was at a conference in Brazil in 2017, and a quite brutal crowd assembled outside and burnt me in effigy. It was a kind of distorted picture of me, and I had horns, which I thought was anti-Semitic. But I was also wearing a bikini, which was very kind of counterintuitive, so that they were assuming a kind of core masculinity, and then they were having me in drag by wearing a bikini. But if they were doing that, then they kind of accepted my theory. Anyway, it was pretty confusing, but it was brutal. And I saw that I couldn't go out and I couldn't walk in the streets. And I was very easily recognized. And there was a violent animus. And indeed, at the airport, they did attack me with a trolley. And luckily, I escaped that because some nice man intervened and took the blows for me. Who is that man? I'd like to meet him. I'd like to finance his college education, whatever I can do. I'll never meet him. But I think what I want to say is that then it became clear to me that I was somehow understood to have authored this idea of gender, although that's obviously not true. I was a feminist who was reading in gender theory, gender studies, and feminist studies for a decade and a half before I wrote Gender Trouble. And of course, gender has gone on to mean other things than what I intended. There's no way I am at the origin. I'm not. But I was placed there and attacked for that. And I see that in other places of the world that is also true, which is why, in a way, I decided to write this book. They had given me a platform. It's like, oh, so if you think I am the face of the phantasm, I'm going to write a book about the phantasmatic orchestration of anti-gender ideology discourse. And I suppose it was a way of working it out or understanding what had happened to me, but also what's happening to a whole lot of people who are losing jobs or facing censorship or losing immigration status or being denied healthcare or being denied education. So, it's hardly a personal matter. It seemed to me that even when they were attacking Judith Butler, I was a very separate creature. I wasn't the figure or the phantasm that they were attacking, which gives me some critical distance. And maybe it's from that critical distance that I wrote the book.
I asked Professor Butler the question that so often keeps me up at night, which is, how do we continue hoping that things can change when the more we learn about the anti-gender movement, the worse it seems? I just want to say, I took Lori's class this past fall, and it was the intro gender studies course. And the first thing that we actually learned was your first chapter of Gender Trouble.
Uh-huh.
I remember it was the first time that it was just like my brain hurt so much. But
I should apologize. I should probably apologize. Yeah.
No, I'm really happy it did, honestly. As I've taken more and more gender studies classes and I've been learning more about the anti-gender movement, I've become more pessimistic, just like in the world and with all the different policies that are being implemented, especially in my home state, with Ron DeSantis.
Scary, very frightening.
And I wanted your opinion on how it's possible to stay hopeful in like this, and how do I be a better activist in the face of all of this?
Your question is super important, Elle, and thank you for posing it. I often feel exactly as you do. And I know, especially for younger people, it's really frightening to think what world are we entering into and what future is still possible. These seem to be really fundamental questions that a lot of people are asking themselves right now. Milei in Argentina, he's the new president, and he's negating their gender self-determination law that was so progressive and going against a bunch of feminist policies and LGBTQIA plus policies. And it looks like everything's being destroyed that people have worked so hard to build. But there were like 1 million people on the streets protesting him. I saw these pictures. It's like unbelievable. The number of people who came out, right? Like unbelievable. And they're from like the trade unions and the janitorial staff and the progressive Christians. Let's remember, there are progressive Catholics, progressive evangelicals, progressive Episcopalians. There are all sorts of Jesuits who are still on progressive left circles. The Christian communities are divided here. They're not one thing. And I would say that's also true of most religions, if not all. So we made a lot of progress, I think, huge amount of progress. And the right is reacting to that. They want to restore an older version of society, like men were men and women were women. Everybody knew their place and hierarchies and racial supremacy and all the rest. But theirs is a kind of furious and impossible nostalgia. That's the way I think about it. It's like they're trying to restore something. It's like, it's gone. It's already gone. So it's precisely because we made such progress that they rose up against us. And so, we call it reactionary politics for a reason, right? It's reacting to enormous strides that were made. And all we have to do is reassemble and keep going. Look what the French just did. Everybody thought, oh my God, fascism, it's taking over. And they're like, no. A bunch of people got together and produced a left that's larger than the neoliberal center and the fascist right. I don't know how they did that in a couple of weeks, but they did. The feminists throughout Latin America, there are feminists throughout Central Europe. There are massive networks of people who are going to continue to push back in education, in public policy, in law, in healthcare, in the academic world. And some of them are losing jobs or risking their reputations or having to move countries. But there continues to be a resistance. So you might ask the question, what can I do to be an activist during such deeply pessimistic times? I would say, got to change the question. With whom do I act? What collaboration do I need to be part of? What collectivity do I want to act together with, right? Because when you're acting together with others, you're not just fighting that enemy, you're also regenerating each other. You're giving each other hope and joy. So even on Palestine, I just remember I wasn't there at the Washington March last fall, the really large one, but friends of mine, Palestinian, I said, oh my God, I saw these people I haven't seen forever. We were crying, laughing in each other's arms and singing, telling jokes, telling stories, protesting, crying. And I just thought, that's regenerative. That's solidarity that gives us hope together when we can't find traces of hope in the world. We can't find it among each other. And it is a kind of form of care, as Dean Spade has argued. Solidarity is care work. And we care for one another and we pick each other up. We lift each other up. And so the question is who you want to act with, maybe.
And to finish it off, I asked them how we can build a vision of the future less focused on fear and lies. Lori and I heard you at the conference in London this past February, which was amazing. And I've been thinking a lot. I always come back to a few different things that you said, one of which is making truth sexy. And then the other one is building a vision of the future that is more compelling, yeah, than anything that the fascist far right can dream up. And so I've been thinking a lot about imagination and visions of the future. What does that look like in reality? How do we fight when the right is using the technique of invoking fear?
Yes.
How do we stick to telling the truth and not falling into those same strategies, but also building a vision of the future that is better than the options right now?
Yeah. I think that the right is circulating what I call phantasms. They're like specters. They don't correspond to reality, but they're a kind of fearful exaggeration of certain features, the great replacement theory. Oh, white people will not have rights anymore. The threat of race studies, it will undermine the foundations of the country, or they tend to spike fear with a kind of phantasm of what could happen, right? And it is a falsehood and it is a lie, as you say. But then the question is, how are we appealing to passions? How are we appealing to what people desire from this world, the kind of world they desire to live in with each other? Have we marshaled the possibilities of imagination and experimentation through a variety of media, including digital media? to communicate a vision of the world that would not be populated with phantasms, with false representations, but would be a kind of alternative imaginary, what we might call a counter imaginary, a way of thinking about the world we want to live in, even when, as Elle points out, we're deeply pessimistic about the future, right? But can we work with artists? Can we work with digital activists? Can we think about a form of imagination that also calls upon the passions, right? Like passions for peace, passions for nonviolence, passions for freedom, for equality, for letting the truth be known, a passionate love of truth, right? What would it mean for us not just to be the intellectuals or the critics, like, oh, they're lying, Trump's a liar, and I can show you the 14 lies. Like, all right, I know we can do that. We have to do that, don't get me wrong. But we also have to produce something that's compelling, which is not false, right? And in my mind, a lot of art doesn't correspond exactly to reality, but it can illuminate something critical about reality, and it can illuminate truths. It's not a falsehood in the sense of a lie. It's an imaginary construct, if I'm allowed to say that word still, that that gives us a way to hold on to the truths that are most important to us. So yeah, I do think we have to work with our artist pals. I think we should bring in artists, become artists. I think we need to generate better passions, passions for freedom, passions for democracy in the radical form, passions for truth. Why not? Otherwise, all the passions on the other side, and we become these kind of dried up critics who have nothing to say except what's false and what the other says. So, yeah.
All right, everyone, you heard Professor Butler. Go make a more compelling, more imaginative, more pleasurable, more feminist future. And do not lose hope. That's the way the anti-gender movement wins. It feeds off of our despair. So make art, make love, make protests, do something, anything to create a better future.
As always, thank you to everyone who made this episode happen: Lori Essig, Allison Seeger, and Julian Seeger-Reed. Thank you to our student team, Elle Fahey, Daisy Kulina, Christina Ritter, and I'm Harper Nichols. And a huge thank you to Professor Judith Butler for taking the time to speak with us and for making all of our dreams come true. So keep fighting, keep reading, keep caring, and keep tuning in to Feminism, Fascism, and the Future.